Professor Holland from the University of Michigan. He's a professor of psychiatry and a professor of electrical engineering and computer science. He's a very well-established researcher. He is the author of many books, including one that I actually read when I was a first-year PhD student. Adaptation in Natural and Artificial Systems. This book was on genetic algorithms, introduced genetic algorithms. So I studied that as a PhD student. I just checked Google Scholar for this book. It has more than 15,000 citations. It's amazing. So Professor Holland is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Scientific Institute. He's a recipient of MacArthur Fellowship. He's a fellow of the World Economic Forum. He has, in addition to the book that I mentioned, there's many other books. His most recent books are Hidden Order, How Adaptation Builds Complexity, and Emergence from Chaos to Order. So, Professor Holland's book talk will be on model of exploratory model of language acquisition and evolution. Thank you.
They claim this microphone is on. Is it? Okay. This is a talk that starts with an examination. How many of you in this audience have ever heard of Eddington? Be honest, I see a couple. How many have not? How many? Yeah, good. All right. Eddington was maybe one of the most famous astronomers of the 20th century. He was the first person to actually do a physical test of Einstein's theory of relativity. So he was extremely well known. And he was very much a man, he tested the theory of relativity by looking at the relative location of a star during an eclipse of the sun. And he saw that the relative location moved, so that proved that mass could bend light, which was a major part of Einstein's theory. Well, this is something we want to talk a bit about here, that the contemplation in natural science of a wider domain than the actual leads to far better understanding of the actual. And I'm going to try to make some of that point today. Part of what we use to discuss such things is to talk about exploratory models. These are models that do not try to match data. What they try to do is give you some broad understanding of how things might work. And usually a good exploratory model will suggest new experiments. I'm going to use language because it's an area in which there is a great deal of data, a huge amount of data, but relatively little understanding of how children acquire language, or indeed, since they're closely related, it seems, how language evolved from pre-linguistic basis. So, I'm going to talk about an agent-based model. That means we're looking at a model which has several individuals. These individuals act according to some set of rules in these simple models, and the agents learn as they interact. So those are the basic things that we're going to take as background. I'll say more about that. But one of the things that's important here is these agents will use language in an environment, in a world, so that this is very Darwinian. Agents will not survive unless the language helps them do better in that environment. So, say it another way, we don't ahead of time say to the agents, oh, language is something valuable, how do you learn it? Language will only appear in these models if it turns out to be valuable in this world. And of course, since we're doing this with computer-based models, we can also compare this to a model in which the agents can't acquire language at all. So part of our objectives, and by the way, if you have questions, I'm more than willing to try to answer them as I go along. If I think they're too complicated, I'll delay it to the end. I'm trying to leave some time at the end for discussion. So this is a model which concentrates on the social nature of language, not on an individual, but how does language acquired, how is language acquired, and how does it provide for social interaction. The agents have, in this case, because we're interested in how they learn the language, no wired in things ahead of time directly relevant to language. And we expect, first of all, if you look at models like this, we would expect, because they are social, we would expect to see networks of interaction. That's very much a hot topic right now. We would expect to see something that begins to look like a grammar that says, well, if I utter two words, they have to be in a certain order. For instance, in English, it's usually subject and then verb. We'd expect to see something like this emerge. At least that's what we're going to try to test. Meanings, I'll say a little bit about this later, but we'll look at meanings as a kind of class of things that we consider equivalent. Now, an important fact here is that during your lifetime, you never see exactly the same pattern of light on your retina. So the world from the point of view of the retina is perpetually novel. You never see the same thing twice. So the only way that you can learn about this world is to find patterns. From a mathematician's viewpoint, those are equivalence classes. So I recognize a tree because it's made in a certain way. It has certain building blocks, but I'll never see exactly the same projection on my retina of a given tree, even if I look at it over and over again. Okay, so perpetual novelty is something we have to treat, and if this works, we would expect the agents to get more and more diverse, more complex over time. And again, in the case of language, just think of all the dialects and languages there are in the world. Why, after all this time of using language, isn't there one super language? Why isn't there one language that everybody uses? There isn't. And for instance, if you go into, say, the southeast part of China, where typically in the Western world we call these dialects, but they are really, by the normal standard, if it were in Europe, each one of those dialects would be a full-fledged language. So this diversity is an interesting problem in itself. And it doesn't go away. Okay. So we're going to look at three basic things that you have to think about when you look at any agent-based model, whether it's the immune system, whether it's the language, whether it's the stock market, where you're dealing with interactions between agents. The first thing is that you have to define the performance of the agent. How does the agent do what it does? Now this doesn't involve learning it all. This is just, what's the agent's capacity right now? What rules is it using right now? The second problem that you get is called credit assignment. And the easiest way to explain credit assignment is, if you're a good player in a game, you may make an early move that's not at all obvious, like the sacrifice of a piece in chess, in order to accomplish something much later that's valuable. And in this case, how do you get credit for the obvious good move in chess, where maybe you checked the king, to the earlier move that sacrificed a piece in order to give you a good position? How do you get the credit back from the obvious useful thing to the earlier thing that may have not been obvious at all? That I'll call credit assignment. And then finally, if you do credit assignment, you'll find that some of your performance rules are good and some are not. What do you do about the bad ones? Well, you just as soon get rid of them. And so that's the problem of rule discovery. But rule discovery, you often see in some literatures, they suggest, well, do it at random. Just try new rules at random. After all, they're part of a population. The random ones won't survive. The problem there is, much like putting an instruction at random in a computer program. You know that's just not going to work. There's no use trying to do it that way. There has to be some principled way to discover new rules. some way that uses past experience and builds plausible new rules, not random new rules. So those are the three things that we'll be looking at along the way here. Okay, so each agent has some, you can call them wired-in capacities. It has a set of detectors for looking at the world. So these are the typical things that you use in saying, well, that's a moving object, that's a large object, that's a small object, and so on. We'll call those detectors. So this is the way you have a whole, you can have hundreds of these. And we often build agents with hundreds of these. This is not a problem. This is just a group of algorithms that do a binary detection on the current input. Is this property there or isn't? You have a limited set of actions. After all, you have relatively few muscles and you can only use them in certain ways. So you have a limited range of actions. We're going to concentrate on rules that process signals. So they receive a signal, and if that signal satisfies their condition, they send a signal. Now these signals in general won't have any direct meaning. So this is like the firing of neurons in your central nervous system. It either spikes or it doesn't. There's no particular meaning to that spike, except insofar as it spikes and activates other neurons. So we'll take this signal processing approach, and then in the end we have to talk about procedures for generating new rules. So that's roughly what we're going to be talking about. Agents in these kinds of models have needs or things that they have to fulfill. We do this generally in terms of talking about reservoirs. The agent has reservoir. It has to take actions in its world that will help it fill those reservoirs. So it needs food, for instance. It has an action called consuming. So when food is present, if it consumes, if it does the chewing action or whatever, then it will fill that reservoir partially, and that rule that's directly involved, will be strengthened. So if the agent eats when food is present, in other words, it's in the middle of a food patch and it decides to eat, that rule, which is obvious in that case because it filled the reservoir, gets strengthened. This is where this credit assignment comes in. That's okay, that rule gets stronger, but how do I get the rules ahead of that let the agent get to the food patch get strengthened? Okay, same thing you can have, for instance, agents need shelter. If it takes the action of laying down and resting, that will strengthen the rule causing rest, and so on. Oops, I always press the center button. So here we're going to talk first about performance. So we're going to put this agent in an environment, and it has a very simple thing, I'll call it a vision cone, which has a direction that it's looking, and then the detectors will tell us something about what's along the line that it's looking. So for instance, here's our agent in a simple world which has shelter and water and food, and it can see that there is a food patch, a water patch that's centered, and off to the right and the left there are things like food patches and shelter patches. And its object is to maneuver in this world in such a way as to keep the reservoirs from going empty. Is there any particular question about this approach to giving our agents desires or needs or wants? Okay, so here's a few simple detectors. One is a detector that simply says, is that reservoir empty or full? So it's just keeping track of how your stomach feels. Okay, and if the food reservoir is low, then that detector gets turned on. Otherwise, it just sits inactive. Then there are a pair of detectors that look for the visibility of the food patch. You think back to that vision cone, and it says there's no food patch visible, or there's a food patch on the right or on the left, or the food patch is centered, meaning it's on that vector. If we go back, the water patch there is centered. The others are off to the left or right. And then finally, there's a detector that says, am I actually in the food patch, or is it still somewhere off away from me? Now, this is a very simple set. As I say, generally, we'd have 100 or more of these. but I just want to keep the example from being complex. Now you can see from a computational viewpoint, these are just on or off bits in a string, and so it's very easy to do the computations here. Finally, we'll give our agent a tag, we call it a tag, that says this particular signal is coming from the detectors. So 0000 says this particular set of bits is coming from the detectors. What if it didn't know that? What if if it got a signal and it was no way that it know it was coming from the detectors? That's almost a perfect definition for a hallucination. If it has an internal signal that gives the same information but comes from the internally, then this is just purely imagination as far as the agent is concerned. So we need an identifier, in this case 4 zeros, that says this particular signal came from the detectors. Okay, so if there's a food patch in the right periphery, 0000 says it came from the detectors, and the red 0 and the red 1 says that it's a food patch in the right periphery. And the other two detectors are off. Okay, for the effector side of performance, we'll just allow this agent some very simple things. It can do a random walk. It can move the vision vector right 15 degrees or left 15 degrees. It can move forward, which means moving along the direction of the vision vector. And the effector signal will also have a tag 111 to say this is directed, this signal is supposed to go to the effectors to determine the performance. Okay, so if I have 111 and then this red 1, it means move the vision vector, and go back, move that right 15 degrees. That's all it does. Now, another question. What would happen if, say, the food were 30 degrees off to the right, and I have a rule that says if there is food off to the right, move the vision vector 15 degrees? What would happen? Exactly. It would move to the right twice because that rule stays active as long as there's food off to the right. So it, in effect, even though it's a relatively simple rule, it's a rule for causing the vision vector to be centered on wherever there's a food patch.
Wouldn't it move to the right 3 times? Since
Aha!
it still sense it in the center?
Oh, when it senses it in the center, then the other rule, here, let's go back to that rule. That rule would go off because that red 1 would go to 0 because now it's centered. It's not off to the right anymore.
Centered set both bits.
Sorry?
I thought
No. It does not. Centered only goes on when the... here, we have to go back one. See? Only it's 1-1 when the food patch is centered.
Right.
So it only... so that the condition for that rule requires both a 1 and a 1. It won't move right anymore if both 1s are on.
Oh, it's checking for a 0, 1.
Yeah.
It's the 1 in the right spot.
Yeah. I just highlighted the 1 because that was the critical. Yeah, quite so. Okay. So I won't spend much time on this because but here's a set of rules that would cause you to go to a food patch and eat. And in terms of credit assignment, the question is, how do I get the first rule? Okay, I'm pushing the wrong thing, maybe. Yeah. How would I get this first rule strengthened? Because it is active long ahead of the time when I do the consuming thing. So our question for credit assignment is to strengthen this rule, even though it's only this rule that's being directly strengthened by eating. Now, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but I just want to emphasize the fact that in these agents, they don't have anything that's directly related to language wired in. Here are the capacities that are wired in. They can imitate, especially utterances, and this we know, it's amazing. Any of you that have seen a very young child, when it's only a day or two old, if the mother smiles, the baby will imitate the mother's smile. Now think about that. That's a complex process because it's taking in a visual pattern and causing muscles to move around the mouth. Okay, that is a capacity that apparently is genetically wired in. Okay. We all know the reflex that if you have a fast-moving object in the periphery of your vision, you just automatically turn to look at the object. And in fact, most animals, mammals, have this reflex. They do distinguish between things that are static and things that are moving. And one thing that's very interesting is animals that herd in packs, that hunt in packs, are aware if two of them are looking at the same prey. They both know that they're looking at the same thing, and this is in fact what lets wolves and other animals like that plan attacks, because they both know what their target is, and they're both aware that the other one is looking for the same target. This is not so familiar, but it's easy to test. And then finally, we need some kind of learning procedure. So this is what's wired in to these agents that we're dealing with here. Now, we do a system like this in terms of a set of rules, and many rules can be active at the same time, not just one. They're competing for activity, and we'll talk about that. But if I get a message from the detector, blue here, it will be checked against all the conditions for all the rules. Whichever rule is looking for that, or there may be more than one rule that's looking for that message, will in turn send a message. So that's the signal processing. That message goes to a list of the current signals. So there may be a lot of signals inside the system. Again, like all your neurons firing all the time. Okay, there may be lots of messages at any given time. This particular message has that tag 1111, so it goes to the effectors and causes an action. So I'll give you a simple example. Here's an agent with such a system. The agent sees this small, sweet-smelling object. Some people would call that an Oreo. And then, because of the detectors, it gets a message from the detectors that has all these properties listed on it. That message satisfies this rule, so it will emit a new signal or message which goes onto that list, but also causes the effectors to become active. And at that point, it makes an utterance, one of the simple actions it can do. So it does the utterance cookie. Now, one thing that's useful here, again, very young child, from early on, way before language, children do a lot of things like random movement of their hand, babbling, all kinds of sounds. And again, because of the imitation effect, if the mother smiles when they utter a particular sound, the baby will repeat that sound because it gets a reward, a smile. Okay? So think of what's going on in a newborn as trying to begin to control their world. The first time a child, and this is really fun to watch, the first time a child can move their hand across their vision twice in a row in the same direction, you see a smile spread across their face. This is finally this great buzzing, blooming confusion. There's part of it that they can do something about, part of it they can control. And the same goes with babbling and utterances. I have a granddaughter. You always hear these tales from old timers. I have a granddaughter who long before she could talk, learned that if she said, hi, 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 everybody would look at her and smile. And so we would take her to the supermarket, and it was hi, hi, hi all day long. While she didn't have any language, but she knew that this caused an effect. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah, good.
If you have multiple messages and have multiple rules satisfied, and then which one are you going to choose to act?
Exactly the right question. We let them all act, because all an active rule does is add another signal to the list. You may get your list awfully crowded with signals, but that's what the system has to learn, is what signals should it emit, which ones should it use.
Act at the same time.
Yeah. Yep. So now the only place you can get a conflict in the system, these are all signals, but I may get a message out to the effector that says turn right and turn left. Now I can't do anything about that, but notice it's much easier to resolve conflicts out there than it is in the interior. And the simplest way is simply you have a competition between the two rules, and the strongest one usually wins. This turns out to be, or so I think, an interesting all in itself. These parallel message passing systems, they're fun to look at. Oh, yeah.
Are these agents all acting independent of each other?
Yes. The only way they can affect each other is through signals through the detectors. So they can't, there's no way that they can get inside the other one's head. Okay, now I will spend a lot of time on this, but again, meanings can be, we've got this, let's say we have 100 detectors that are binary. How many messages, different messages, can we get from the detectors? Huge number, right? 2 to the 100th. Huge number. Obviously, you're not going to see in general, especially if the world is at all random, the same message ever twice from the detectors. So you have to say, oh, these messages are all alike. Mathematically, that says they all belong to the same equivalence class. So part of what this system has to learn are what are the repeating patterns in its world? What are the patterns that repeat? Because the messages will never repeat. Okay. So we will call those meanings. So if you keep getting a signal, and let's say it's somehow, and I'll be just a little bit fanciful here, associated with something you want to call a tree, then a tree is an equivalence class over all possible signals that are tree-like. And this typically goes, and we won't have much time to talk about this kind of thing, but notice that you understand your world in terms of building blocks. So you can see something like a vertical line, and then you see some horizontals and a few other fuzzy things, and that's a tree. But the way you see the world is in terms, and there's a lot to be said here, but is in terms of how things are structured. And that's in terms of how are different kinds of building blocks put together. I can say a lot more about that, and I will say something about it this afternoon, in the lecture this afternoon, but we really don't have time here to go much. Generalization. This symbol means you don't care. And so in a condition, the condition will accept anything that's a 1 and a 1 at the beginning and the end, and it doesn't care what the 2 in the middle are. Okay, that turns out then to be a class that includes this message and this message, so it is quite formally a generalization of these two. In other words, it's an equivalence class across that set of messages. Now, again, I'm not going to spend much time on that, but you can show that by doing these kinds of things, you can build sets with intersections, unions, all the things you formally expect of equivalence classes in mathematics. And I'm not going to talk about metaphor-like properties. That's a whole area in itself. But here's something that is, I think, quite important. Think of something, call it maybe a frog, that has a very general rule. It says, if there's anything moving, that's all I'm looking for. I don't care about anything else. If there's something moving, get the heck out of there. Now, for a frog, about 60% of the things in the world that are going to do it damage are moving objects. Okay? So that's a rule that's statistically better than random. It's wrong a lot of the time, but it's better than a random rule. Okay? Now, however, this poor unfortunate frog is never going to do any mating because female frogs tend to move. So, and other things also, flies are moving objects that it wants to eat. So this rule is a default rule. It says if I don't have any other information, do this. Very much like defaults in computers. Okay, but now I have a second rule which uses more information. I'll call it a specialist, and its effect is because it uses more information, it overrides the default. So in this case, if the object is small and winged and moving, then it will approach because presumably it's a fly or some insect that it can eat. Okay. Interesting thing about this. First of all, notice, excuse me, general rules because they don't require much information from a statistical point of view, are checked much more frequently. So the fact that it's 60% and not 50% is something that's confirmed in a statistical fashion quite early on. The specialist rules require more information, they're checked much less frequently, and so they come later in the learning process. Now, the other thing that may not be so obvious is that the approach rule and the flee rule are symbiotic. They each help the other one. And the less obvious part is if this rule is activated, it prevents this rule from making a mistake. And so under any kind of algorithm that rewards success, this one is prevented from making a mistake. It gets stronger just because this one is around. And this one, because it overrides and takes exactly the right action, also gets rewarded. So very much in a biological sense, these two rules are symbiotic. Now you can build default hierarchies with many levels, and it begins to look more and more like an ecosystem where all the things interact in such a way that all of them survive a bit better. I won't go through the example. Another rule that I'll just mention briefly is a bridging rule. Now these are all rules of the same if-then form. It's just what information they use. Here's an example of a bridging rule. Here we are. It's at the end of the day. We're here in our office, and it's evening, and it turns out that my shelter reservoir is getting low. Okay, so under those circumstances, I have a message that says, I'm in the office, it's in the evening. This message, it goes up, and it also has a condition that says, I'm really tired. And so what happens is this rule that says it's evening and that I'm tired will stay on until I do something to this reservoir. So that's a bridge. It stays on. It gives me focus. It says, I'm hungry and I'm tired and it's evening. And now the rules tell it what to do. The message says it's evening. The first thing is I'm in my office. I get this general message, drive home. Drive home together with office says go to the parking lot. Okay? It doesn't say I can't jump to home. I've got to do some steps. So I go to the parking lot. Now I'm in the parking lot. It still says drive home. And here's a rule that says go to the expressway. And you can see on and on. This bridging rule stays on, whoops, until I finally get home and fill that reservoir, or at least make it not low. So this is the way this system builds subroutines. These are subroutines, and you can combine this, and we've actually done these experiments with a default hierarchy to see how you can build these bridging rules and how you can get focused sequential action. It turns out that these systems I'm talking about, these so-called classifier systems, are computationally complete. So if you can write an algorithm in C, you can write a set of rules that will do the same thing. Okay, final thing, and this is more about building blocks. The whole business about language, and for 40 years this was almost all that anybody looked at, was the notion of a grammar, a formal grammar. How do you sequence words? And this was started by Chomsky at MIT. This became the major basis of linguistics for over 30 years. It's only recently that the younger generation of linguists is beginning to talk about social interactions in language, which you can't do at all with formal grammars, about social interaction, about how you might learn grammars, not have them wired in, and so on. And there is a young generation of linguists that's very much working at this. The great advantage of a grammar is that you can have a small amount of utterances and get a lot of meaningful strings of utterances. And this is the same old combinatorial thing that in this case, if I have 60 meaningful triples set up by the grammar, I only need 12 utterances to generate those 60. And this goes up exponentially. Let's see. Well, I guess you can try it sometime if you want. Let's say that you have 20 utterances. Then this goes up into the thousands. And if you have a few hundred utterances, it goes up into the hundreds of millions, actually. So the advantage of a grammar is to let you have a very small set of utterances, which you can learn relatively easily. But then as you learn a grammar, you can use all sorts of strings of utterances to say or indicate things that you couldn't do otherwise. Largely, you can say this is a little bit of an overstatement, but the value of having a string of utterances is it reduces the ambiguity. A child will utter something like the word milk, and that can mean there's a milk bottle over there, bring the milk bottle to me, or my baby sister is grabbing the milk bottle. It can mean any of those things. But then if the child says, bring milk, the ambiguity of the situation is much reduced and the child gets rewarded. Okay, so grammars are important. I'll simply say that you can use a bridge in just the way we were talking about in going home to build up a sequence where you only allow an action word first and then you have another bridge that allows you to use a modifier and an object. There's a simple three sequence utterance grammar. And what we would like to do with these agent-based models is to see such capabilities emerge from an agent that has no grammar at all to start with. Now, in the school of universal grammars, the Chomsky kind of approach, they claim this can't happen because they say there's not enough stimulation, not enough stimulus. They call it the poverty of stimulus argument. However, if you start asking, what are the real stimuli that are going back and forth between the agents, babbling, the kinds of things, the mother's smiling and so on, there's not a poverty of stimulus. The question is, how do you use it? Okay, just a few words about rule discovery. How do I generate plausible new rules? So I've got some rules that aren't any good. They're wasting space. I would like to replace them with new rules that are plausible in terms of system experience. Now, the point here is, again, that much as we're seeing now in genetics, new rules are made up of pieces of rules that I'm already using, just as the transcriptions in genetics are made up of pieces, so-called exons, that are transcribed. And recent articles show that this is by far the prevalent process, that you can have even the same gene being transcribed and get different proteins from the same gene because it recombines different pieces of the gene. There's a nice article in the most recent American Scientist, if you're interested in this. It makes this, has good diagrams and really makes this process clear. So first thing is, think of the default rules. They're almost all don't cares. So if I have 100 detectors, say, and I'm only interested in detectors that have 99 don't cares and 1 prescription for a detector, how many default rules are there of that kind? 100 positions. I want one position to either be a 1 or a 0 and all the rest to be don't cares. Exactly. So I can test all those rules ad nauseum. There are not so many of them. I can really try each one. And in these systems, the right way to say this is rules are not facts. They're hypotheses to be tried. I try this default rule. If it's better than random, I keep it. Most of these 200, 195 are probably not going to be any valuable at all. They'll go by the board. They'll be immediately lost. But the one that's a bit better than random, it plays the role of the default. And then, by using the kind of thing that goes on in genetics, by breeding rules in the same way that, say, a plant biologist breeds plants by crossbreeding, or that a horse breeder breeds horses by crossbreeding, what do you do when you crossbreed? Well, you pick a horse maybe that has nice long legs and another horse that has very powerful shoulders, and you crossbreed it, hoping to get a horse that has nice long legs and powerful shoulders. And this is, this has been known long before we knew genetics. Crossbreeding is an old thing. Okay. If I take rules that way, and I think about the parts of the rules that are not these don't cares, and I crossbreed those rules, two things happen. I'm going to get a rule that uses more information because it combines conditions from two different rules, and it will fit under the default rule. So crossbreeding is a way, and this is all about genetic algorithms, and that's not what this talk is about, but crossbreeding is a way of generating plausible new rules from pieces of old rules, and a consequence is you automatically begin to develop a default hierarchy that way. Building blocks. I'll just say a few more words about building blocks. In all the things that we look at, such as language, there are building blocks. There are levels where I combine phonemes to get morphemes. I combine morphemes to get sentences. I combine letters to get words. I combine words to get sentences. All of this has to do with this business of crossbreeding, default hierarchies, and so on. At each level, I have units, just like the kind of thing. Here's another, a little bit fanciful, but it works. I have 10 different properties for faces: hairstyle, forehead shape, eyebrow shape, and so on. Different features or properties of faces. And now I allow 10 alternatives for each feature. So I have 10 eyebrow shapes, 10 eye shapes, and so on. Here's a question I ask my graduate classes, and usually only one or two answer it. How many building blocks do I have? I hear a right answer. I have 10 sacks with 10 building blocks in each sack. How many building blocks do I have? 100. Same thing here, right? 10 sacks with 10 alternatives in each sack. So there's 100 building blocks. How many faces can I make? 10 to the 10th. One from each one. 100 building blocks, 10 to the 10th faces. That's all the faces Obama is ever going to see. So, building blocks are what let me construct complex objects. Claim. If you go to a zoo, unless you're a trained keeper of chimpanzees, they'll all look pretty much alike to you. You won't be able to distinguish one from another. Why? Why are you so good at human faces and not so good at chimpanzees? You don't have the right building blocks. The zookeeper who has been building up those building blocks can distinguish them all as easily as he can distinguish one human from another. But we can't, because we don't have the right building blocks. That's the claim. Look at the face now. Here's a face, and one consequence of this is that I can represent a complex geometric object by a string of digits. And that really is helpful. Think of our rules then, and you can see what role this plays. So this is a face, and it was legitimately built this way, with eyebrow 1, eye shape 4, nose shape 2, mouth shape 3. Now what if I built two faces like this and crossbred them? What would crossbreeding mean? Well, it would mean that I would take this string, cut it in half, and transfer just what's called crossover in genetics, that half to the other string, and vice versa. You get two new faces, and they're both plausible faces. That's part, again, of the reason of getting building blocks. So what we're looking for are these same kinds of building blocks in our default hierarchy for producing grammars. Here's just some elementary stuff. You could give a standard set of building blocks, I think there's 7 here, yeah, to a child that's, say, 4 or 5, and ask them to build a castle. And they'll do it right away. Combinatorially, that's impossible. They certainly didn't do it by trial and error. Okay? They had a vision of what they were after. Now look at this castle, and look at this set of 3. Now there are only 4,000 of those. A child will learn how to build that before it learns how to build this. And a child will learn how to do this before it does this. Notice, at this level of combination, this plus this lets you build this. That again is part of this business of default hierarchies, learning pieces, building blocks, combining them in certain ways, and then getting building blocks at still higher levels. And my claim is that an awful lot of what we call innovation is just this kind of thing. A vision that says, this is where I'd like to get, and here are some of the pieces that will go together to make it. Claim is that language is that way too. There's the crossover that I was talking about, just so you can see it. Here are the 10 digits. Here's one face. Here's another face. Here are the two faces that result from crossover. And I'll tell you a little fanciful experiment. If we had the time, we could do it here. I show you a set of 10 faces generated at random in this way. So I show you a set of 10 faces, and I ask you to do something like, and it's interesting, you can do this in a psych class all the time, pick the most honest faces in that set. Now, none of us could write a good definition of honesty, especially in relation to faces. But if you give it to a particular student, that student will rank the faces according to honesty. You know, it says this one's much more honest than this. Then what do? I take the ones that are ranked high and I crossbreed them in this fashion to get 10 more faces. I ask you to do the same thing a second time. I can guarantee that after 5 generations, almost every face in the last generation will look more honest than any face in the first generation. Now that's what natural selection does for you in terms of selecting combinations of building blocks that are relevant. And the nice thing is, if you do this experiment, after the fact, you can go in there and see what are the common properties for the honest faces for that person. And it turns out usually to be just 3 or 4 things. You know, a certain nose shape or something like that. Oh, that's an honest person. So there are interesting things that can be done even at a pretty elementary level in psychology once you start doing things like this. I'm not going to talk about this, or here's what I want to get to now because we're just about out. So this is what we call an exploratory model. We're not trying to match data. What we're trying to do is find mechanisms or pieces that could fit together to generate a grammar. Now, if the model fails, then we begin to know where we should look, what should we add to the model. If the model succeeds, we dance on the table. So that's one reason for doing exploratory models, and you've seen sort of the reason we use this message passing agent-based form. And because it's Darwinian, survival is the key. It has to do better in this environment. It has to fill the reservoirs more often and so on. And you can do the control experiment. You have a set of agents that don't have language and a set that do, and you see if they actually do better. Okay? Conditions, the performance is completely determined by these signal processing rules that it has internally, so we can see exactly what it can do. And then each agent supports sequential action through bridging rules. We didn't talk about triggering mechanisms, but it's related to this business of generating default hierarchies. And finally, in this particular case, we use genetic algorithms, namely crossbreeding, for discovering new rules. And that's it. What are the results? Yes, we're still in the pre-table dancing phase. We have built classifier systems with literally hundreds of rules and hundreds of detectors. And what we have found, and I've actually published this, is that we can build up sequences by credit assignment. So we've actually seen that we can start a system that has no sequencing, and using these techniques, it will build up sequences that lead to what here were quoted as reservoirs. So that much we know. We're still in the process of building models that use data about languages. And I'll tell you one example that really, really surprised me. I have a colleague in Singapore who was a professor in mainland China right after the Cultural Revolution. So she had no PhD, but she was teaching at the college level because there were very few people available. She went to Lund in Sweden to get her PhD. And then she came to the University of Toronto to teach, and now she's teaching in Singapore because they made her an offer she couldn't refuse. And that's a whole story in itself, what Singapore is doing right now. Anyhow, she's fluent in Swedish, English, and Chinese. And fluent means really fluent. The only thing that's sort of funny is she's Chinese and she speaks English with a Swedish accent. I kid her a lot about that, of course. But what she did was study young children in each of these three language groups and ask the following question. These are very young children. They're acquiring their very first action words, like beat or hit or grab. So these are they don't have a grammar yet. They're just acquiring these single utterances. What she found in all three language groups is these childs do not acquire those words until they can do the action. Now that's just really surprising, or at least it was to me, that these children know how to do the action first before they will securely acquire the word. And this ties in with a lot of things. You know that no human talks without gestures. Italians use them more than others, but no human talks without gestures. There is clearly a tight connection between gestures and actions and utterances that you use in language. And this we're trying to build into this model. Yeah. Oh, here. Good question.
Oh, I was just wondering how you developed your default rules that you had for these agents. Like, what criteria did you use to pick one set of default rules versus another?
Good. I went over this too fast. What we did, remember I said there were only 200 rules? We just tested, the agent had all 200 rules. It's a parallel system, so it can have all 200 rules. These rules would be active. A lot of these rules didn't do anything, so they received no credit assignment. They didn't get strengthened. The few that did got strengthened, so they became the defaults. Yeah. No, that's a good question. Oh, all right. You do. Yeah, good.
Yeah, that's very, very fascinating. And the question is how to transfer this to other domain of interest. And we are working on two levels. One is particular situation, and the second is, rules, formal rules they describe.
Yeah.
If this is formalized, then it can be transferred to other things.
Yes.
For example, let's take the credit meltdown, right now. Right? The question is, what is
That's
the
another kind of
language
credit
used?
assignment.
What is the language used in the market?
Yeah. Yep.
Because the problem is derivatives, which are built which nobody can understand. And the people like John Soros, they will never use derivatives because nobody understands them.
Yeah.
So if this kind of approach is formalized and transferred to the language and the market, and then you define honesty, not tell them what to do, but to define honesty.
Interesting.
Well, you might develop
Yeah.
a structure for the market, but it's not just balance and do what you want,
Yeah.
but there are some rules which have to be followed in the language between suppliers and
That's
users.
nice. Yeah.
But for this, we ought to formalize this so that people can understand outside of example and outside of looking at the product.
Yeah. Now I have a former student and a very good immunologist, theoretical immunologist at Los Alamos, who have used this same system to study systems of antibodies and antigens. And they've gone much further. But as you say, you need the formal framework described, and then you can see all of these are examples and special cases.
The result would be not to tell people what to do, but to use the language which will make them honest.
Yeah. And Mike has given me a chance for a plug. If you find this interesting, you should read my book, Hidden Order.
So you said the agents are using genetic algorithms to find the right combinations of the building blocks. So in the context of natural selection, we know the mechanism that enables the genetic algorithms. Do we, for human children, do we know those mechanisms?
Not really, but our basic, oversimple assumption is that the child is looking for these simple things like food, like shelter. And for instance, if we wanted to be very explicit, we'd put in a reservoir for the mother's smile. And so if the child doesn't get the mother's smile for 2 days, the reservoir gets pretty low. So we could tune it to that degree. But we feel that this Darwinian aspect of it, that the child is trying to control the exterior world. And that what's going on is this system is continually breeding for getting more repetitions in the exterior world.
But how about recombination? What is the mechanism for the recombination?
Oh, so far we just do it in a straightforward thing. 2 rules or strings, pick 2 strong rules, cross them just as we did for the faces.
But it doesn't reflect any known mechanism in learning.
Well, I'll make this, how to say it. I look at it as the following way. The building blocks for the central nervous system are what Donald Hebb called cell assemblies. If you look at the way cell assemblies interact, a group that are active at roughly the same time are cross-inhibitory, so that only one of them is active at a time in this small group. Now you start taking a group like that and use Hebbian learning with respect to another group, and you'll find you get the effect of crossover. Now that's fast and furious and has not been documented in an actual computer executable model, but most of us believe it. We think that these rules are a little bit like cell assemblies. They're active under certain conditions, and they send signals out to other cell assemblies. Yeah?
John, when you say the rules get reinforced, what effect does that have? In other words, how do you implement reinforcement? Does it mean they stay on the list longer, they have a higher priority? If they fall below a threshold, they're thrown off? What exactly does reinforcement mean?
Okay. A couple of quick things there. First of all, the rules that actually cause help fill a reservoir, they get strengthened. That's easy enough. We just say, okay, we'll add this increment to their strength. Now, the next thing is, what about the rule that's one step earlier that let me do that? How does it get strengthened? And I'll say it quickly. What we have, and this goes back to Mike's point actually, we have a market. Each rule is trying to buy and sell its message. If it buys a message, in other words, wins, and it has to pay part of its strength to buy the message, so it costs it something. The only way it's going to make a profit if it sells that message to another rule that pays at least as much or more. Turns out that this market really works. And so it's like the guy that's mining coal or iron actually in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Eventually, it gets made into an automobile, used to be, in Detroit. And that cash flow eventually gets back to the miner and pays the salary. Okay? That's what a sequence in a market does. And you can even prove a couple of theorems here from using economics, that if you're in a stream of rules that send messages that lead to one of these rewarding acts, eventually this message will be strengthened. Now, the nice thing is, and this is going too far, but bridging rules stay on during the whole time. So that piece of money goes back to the start of the sequence in a very short time. And so you get this thing working from both ends. And now, in the end, what you really have here and have to be careful of, and there are all sorts of things, but derivatives, or things like derivatives, show up in this system. And the question is, how do you control them? For those of you that have not played the stock market, derivatives are where you bundle up a bunch of things like mortgages and sell them, and nobody knows the origin of the mortgages, and you get this huge bubble of value because everybody is saying, oh, I don't care about those mortgages. All I want to do is be able to sell this derivative tomorrow. And that causes a lot of trouble, is causing a lot of trouble. Now, and by the way, that's another complex adaptive system that we would like to know more about. Yeah?
It just struck me when you're saying it, derivatives are basically like the elementary pieces of a cryptographic algorithm that are mixing and diffusing and so forth. So they're actually creating randomness.
Yeah. Yep. And by moving you progressively away from the source, you get exactly these kinds of effects. There, it's usually desirable.
Okay, thank you very much.